In the quiet stretches of medieval Europe, where the earth stretched wide and the villages were small clusters of cottages with thatched roofs, the life of peasants moved slowly, shaped by the seasons and the yield of the fields. The peasants rose early, often before the sun had fully touched the land, and the first thing they would do was tend to the animals. Chickens scratched in the dirt, goats bleated softly, and cows grazed on the dew-laden grass. Food for them was never simply a pleasure. It was a necessity, a careful balance of what the earth provided and what their own hands could cultivate. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was a simple affair. Often, it consisted of bread coarse, heavy, and dark, baked from barley, rye, or sometimes wheat if the lord of the manor allowed it. Wheat was precious, saved for the wealthier, so barley bread was the staple for most. This bread was rarely soft, but it filled the stomach and provided energy for the long hours in the fields. Sometimes the bread was dipped in a bit of thin ale or watered-down milk, giving it a slight warmth and softness. Fresh herbs might be added if the peasants were fortunate enough to grow them, parsley, sage, or thyme imparting the barest whisper of flavor. The midday meal was more substantial, a time when the family gathered, though rarely with any hurry. Pottage, a thick slow-cooked stew, simmered over the fire for hours. Pottage was not fancy. It was a mixture of whatever the earth offered. Cabbage, onions, leeks, and turnips were common, chopped roughly and added to a large pot. Sometimes peasants had access to beans or peas, dried and soaked, then stirred into the broth. Meat was scarce, but when available, it came from the smaller animals, chickens, rabbits, or salted pork left over from the winter. Often, however, pottage was entirely vegetarian, flavored with herbs, salt, and occasionally small bits of fish from rivers or ponds nearby. Every ingredient was precious. Nothing went to waste. On special days, when a feast or holy celebration occurred, peasants might taste something beyond the ordinary. A piece of fresh cheese, rich and crumbly, might be spread over bread, or honey, thick and golden, might be drizzled onto porridge, sweetening it for a brief moment of indulgence. But these were rare pleasures, memories of abundance in a life otherwise measured by necessity. Dinner, the evening meal, was similar to midday fare. Often another portion of pottage, sometimes accompanied by bread and ale. Ale for peasants was weak, barely stronger than a soup, yet it provided warmth in the chill of the evening. Water was available from wells or streams, though it was often cold and sometimes carried the faint taste of mud or earth. Peasants drank it without complaint, for it was the only alternative. Seasonal changes dictated what peasants ate more than any desire or whim. Spring brought fresh greens, nettles, wild onions, sorrel, and sometimes wild garlic. Summer offered berries, cherries, and apples, either eaten raw or baked into rudimentary cakes. Autumn was the time for root vegetables, harvested and stored for the harsh months to come. Winter required careful rationing. Dried grains, preserved vegetables, and salted meats sustained families when the soil was frozen and the wind blew cold across the village. Hunger was a constant companion, not always in its sharp pangs, but in the dull ache that settled at the edges of the stomach. Children learned early that a small meal was better than none, that the crust of bread must be cherished, and that the last sip of ale should never be wasted. Meals were quiet times, broken only by the soft clatter of wooden bowls and spoons, the occasional hum of a lullaby or the gentle snort of a pig outside in the sty. Even the simplest foods carried ritual and routine. Before eating, the family might say a brief prayer, thanking God for the harvest, for the livestock, for the labor that allowed them to sit together. Food was more than sustenance. It was survival, community, and faith entwined in a daily pattern that repeated through every day of the year. Every bite was a reminder of labor, patience, and the slow rhythm of medieval life. Bread could be thick and dense, baked in communal ovens, cooled in the air, and stored in wooden boxes to last for days. Pottage could vary from thin broths to thick hearty stews, its flavor dictated by what was available and the skill of the cook. Occasionally, peasants might add wild herbs, gathered from the meadows, or a bit of milk curdled into cheese to add richness. When meat was present, it was often roasted over an open fire, its aroma carrying through the village, a fleeting luxury to be savored and shared sparingly. As the days drifted by in the slow rhythm of the medieval village, the work in the fields dictated much of the food that appeared on the table. Spring was a season of cautious hope. The soil had thawed, and the peasants turned it carefully with wooden plows and spades, planting barley, oats, and wheat where the Lord permitted. The early shoots of vegetables poked through the earth, and nettles, sorrel, and wild garlic grew freely along the edges of the fields and by the streams. These wild greens were gathered with gentle hands, washed in cool water from the wells, and added to the pot that simmered over the hearth. Often, the pottage was thin and watery in spring, for meat had long since been consumed, and the roots of the winter stores were few. But the green shoots and herbs gave flavor, and the peasants ate with steady hearts, knowing the soil would yield more as the season warmed. Summer brought a quiet abundance, though it was measured and controlled. Berries hung low on the bush, cherries ripened in clusters, and apples began to swell on the trees in the orchards near the village. Children ran through the fields, their laughter soft and fleeting, plucking fruit with sticky fingers, sometimes returning to the family table with small bundles of sweetness. Meals in summer were lighter. Porridge, thickened with oats or barley, could be eaten cold with fresh milk if the heat pressed too heavily by the fire. Vegetables were plentiful: beans, peas, cabbages, and cucumbers. Occasionally, the village pond provided a small fish, and if the lord of the manor allowed, a rabbit or chicken might be added to the pottage, making it richer and more sustaining. Bread remained a constant, its coarse texture unchanging, often still warm from the communal oven, providing a filling complement to the simple stews and porridges. Autumn was a time of labor and preparation. The harvest defined the peasant ear, and the fields echoed with the low sounds of scythes cutting grain, the rustle of stalks as they were gathered, and the occasional call of birds overhead. Turnips, parsnips, and carrots were pulled from the ground, washed and stored in cellars, often layered in straw to preserve them through the long winter. Apples were pressed into juice or dried, small bundles of sweetness to carry the taste of summer into the months of cold. Peasants boiled or roasted what they could, often eating simple combinations of grains and vegetables. Bread remained, sometimes dipped into thin ale or sprinkled with a little salt. Ale was weak, nourishing more than intoxicating, yet it warmed the stomach and softened the dry texture of barley bread. Every meal was quiet, almost meditative, as families prepared for the harsher months to come. Winter, when the wind howled across the frozen fields and smoke curled from every chimney, was the most challenging time for food. Dried grains were ground carefully into coarse flour, boiled into thick porridge, or baked into dense loaves. Root vegetables, preserved and stored, were eaten with what little meat remained, often salted pork or bits of fish that had been smoked or pickled. Milk was stretched carefully, sometimes turned into cheese that would last weeks. Ale became thicker, the slight sweetness comforting against the cold. Every meal required planning. Nothing was wasted, and leftovers were often saved, reheated, or mixed into new pottages. In some villages, the wealthier peasants might have access to honey, a few eggs, or the occasional chicken. But for most, winter was a season of modesty, patience, and endurance. The tools of food preparation were simple. Large wooden spoons stirred the pottage, iron cauldrons hung over open fires, and wooden bowls and trenchers held the meals for families who sat on rough benches or directly on the floor. Hands, weathered from work in the fields, handled the food carefully, for every bit mattered. Bread was torn into small pieces. Vegetables were chopped with basic knives or broken apart by hand. Salt, when available, was used sparingly, and herbs were precious. Each meal, though plain, carried a quiet dignity, a reminder that the survival of the family depended not on luxury, but on care, consistency, and the small rituals of daily life. Occasionally, the village would experience a feast, a brief departure from routine. Holy days, weddings, or the rare festival allowed peasants a glimpse of abundance. Fresh cheese, thick cream, honey, eggs, and even rare spices might appear. Meat, roasted over an open fire, would be shared among families, though still measured and portioned carefully. Such occasions were marked with quiet excitement, the aroma of roasting meat filling the air, the sweetness of honey lingering on the tongue, and the satisfaction of eating beyond necessity. Yet these were rare, and soon the life of pottage, bread, and ale returned, as the slow rhythm of medieval survival resumed. Children learned early the taste of simplicity. They knew the difference between bread baked in the communal oven and the occasional richer loaves of wheat reserved for the Lord. They knew the flavors of wild herbs and the occasional tang of curds or fresh milk. Meals were not rushed. The day had its pace, and so did eating. Each bite was deliberate, each sip measured. Hunger was a companion, but one that taught restraint and endurance. Families ate together, in the quiet light of the hearth, listening to the soft crackle of firewood and the occasional bleat or cluck from the animals outside. There was comfort in this constancy, in knowing that the routine, though simple, sustained them through every season. Within the modest cottages of the village, the rhythm of meals was steady and predictable as the turning of the seasons. Each day began with the gentle, muted light of dawn filtering through narrow windows, and the smell of a small fire burning in the hearth. Breakfast was often little more than a slice of coarse bread, sometimes softened by a bit of milk, or a spoonful of leftover pottage warmed gently over the flames. Children, still sleepy, ate quietly, the simplicity of the meal shaping the quiet start of their day. Adults, hardened by years of labor, ate more deliberately, savoring the nourishment that would sustain them through hours of bending in the fields, carrying water, or tending to the animals. The pottage itself varied in texture and flavor depending on what the earth had yielded and what could be spared from the stores. Sometimes it was a thin, watery concoction of beans, peas, or barley, simmered with onions or cabbage, barely seasoned yet filling. At other times, when the Lord permitted or a small fortune had been saved, the pottage thickened, enriched with small scraps of salted pork, dried fish, or even the occasional egg. Every ingredient was considered carefully. Nothing could be wasted. Roots might be peeled and boiled together, the water left over from the cooking reserved for animals, or even reboiled to flavor the next meal. Herbs, when available, were treasured wild parsley, thyme, or dill gathered from the fields, adding faint notes of freshness to the otherwise earthy tastes. Bread, more than just a source of energy, became a tool of sustenance in itself. It was torn into irregular chunks, sometimes soaked in ale or pottage, sometimes eaten dry. The texture was always dense, heavy in the hand, often still warm from the communal oven. Every loaf was a product of careful work. The grains had been harvested, threshed, milled, kneaded, and baked, all by laboring hands. Even the crust, thick and sometimes hard, was chewed deliberately, a testament to frugality and endurance. Children learned early that the crust was as valuable as the soft interior, and no morsel could be left behind. Dairy products, though often scarce, formed an occasional luxury in the peasant diet. Milk, from cows or goats, was rarely drunk straight, for it was preserved instead through curdling into cheese or butter. Cheese varied in texture, sometimes crumbly, sometimes firm, and could last for weeks, providing a small comfort when vegetables ran low. Butter, though in limited quantities, enriched pottages or spread thinly over bread. Eggs, when available, were a cause for quiet celebration. They could be boiled, fried, or incorporated into a simple bread dough, their richness providing contrast to the plainness of everyday meals. Foraging supplemented cultivated food in subtle, almost invisible ways. Nettles, dandelion greens, wild garlic, and chickweed were gathered from the edges of fields and hedgerows, washed in the cold water of the village well, and stirred into pottage or eaten lightly boiled. Mushrooms, though carefully chosen for safety, were sometimes added, and fruits like blackberries, sloes, or wild apples were gathered in small quantities to flavor porridge or bread. Even the humble acorn might be ground and added to flour during times of scarcity, a bitter but sustaining measure. Each bite of foraged food carried the quiet knowledge of observation, patience, and survival. Festivals and holy days punctuated this rhythm of survival with moments of indulgence. On these days, the kitchen fires burned brighter, the pottage thickened, and occasionally, the smell of roasted meat or fresh pastries filled the cottages. Honey, eggs, and milk featured prominently, along with rare spices, cinnamon, clove, or ginger, usually reserved for special occasions.